by the way, what is an esoteric tradition? Not that easy to define, but we shall try to do so very, very quickly in the beginning. The word esoteric comes from the Greek root eso, which means interior or inner, and from which is derived esoteros, once again in Greek, that means anything related to the inner. Webster's dictionary adds to it in a somewhat highfalutin manner, understood by a chosen few. So inasmuch as you will undoubtedly understand everything and more, you are the chosen few. So keep that in mind, you know. And of course, we all have become familiar with the word tradition, mainly as the result of the words of a modern Hebrew prophet by the name of Tevye. You remember him? Tradition, tradition. No, that's the one. You know, that's the one. And so he has really popularized that term to a major extent. So what we have then is that there are certain approaches to existence, to life, and to the understanding of life and existence, which are handed down in the history of humanity, and certainly they may be documented here and there by literature, but they are not principally based on literature. For instance, a very important branch of the esoteric tradition being the Kabbalah. The very word Kabbalah means that which is handed on. And the Zen Buddhists define their tradition in a very similar manner when they say a special transmission outside of the scriptures. And no reliance on this or that or the anything, only on your own understanding. So there are, therefore, traditions of that nature, and they exist in addition to other traditions that may be somewhat differently oriented. So the esoteric tradition, then, would be the kind of tradition that addresses itself to the reservoir of understanding and inspiration, and indeed life. Life not only, obviously, in the physical and the biological sense, but rather like like in the Jewish religion, Chaim. The Chai is the life. And so many people wear the little letter, which is the initial of, so the life really meaning something much greater, life of consciousness, life of the spirit, life of the total human being. And there is therefore a tradition that addresses itself to the interior resources that the human being possesses in that regard. And then there are many traditions, and certainly a great many of them embodied in very populous and popular large religions, which could be called exoteric traditions at the same time. Because the exoteric traditions, which is the opposite meaning of esoteric, approach this issue and the challenges of the meaning of existence in an external manner, as contrasted with the inner understanding of the esoteric. Just in order to illustrate these two traditions and how they come into existence and how they operate, I have drawn two little inadequate circular diagrams there on the top with my poor artistic talents and poor way of drafting such things. And some of you are familiar with this, because this is also a little schema that is present in my book that Madam President quoted on Jung and the Lost Gospels, that the spiritual traditions, these two, the inner and oriented and the outer oriented, originate in a very similar or perhaps identical manner, but their subsequent development and progress is very different. So that when we look at the top of the circles, we find their abbreviated experience. Spiritual traditions always originate in experience. You may counter, oh yes, but there are a great many of them who say that they originate in revelation. But to that I would answer, what is a revelation but an experience? When you feel, oh, that has been, when you say, oh, something has been revealed to me, that is your experience, obviously. So that's not really that different. And so somewhere, somehow, one person, several persons, have a profound and powerful experience, which is of such magnitude. It is such a mysterium tremendum, as the Romans would have said, a mystery that shakes you up, tremendum, you know, that they find it helpful, probably primarily helpful to themselves, to hand it on in some fashion. Because there are experiences, and certain that you are quite familiar with that, perhaps as the result of what has happened to you, that are really very difficult to contain without in some way being communicated to someone. And so the people who have such experiences then try to pass the result of their experiences on to others, and the manner that is usually done is sort of really an attempt to express the inexpressible. And but this is right. It is right here, quite toward the beginning, that the difference between the exoteric and the esoteric is noticeable, because in the esoteric or the inner tradition, the initial experience, what some of the German scholars, including my dear Carl Jung, have called the Urerfahrung, the original experience, source experience. When they try to pass that on, they usually do so in the form of myth. And we know something about myth, especially since the mythic revival of the late 20th century that included such greats as, I would say, your own, because he lived and taught here for such a long time, Mircea Eliade of the University of Chicago, Joseph Campbell, and a good many others. My countryman Carl Carigny, who actually was an acquaintance of my parents, and he had been in our house, very nice gentleman, and you know, good many others, who represented that mythic revival, and who came to pinpoint something that has really been largely lost for a long time, that the myth is a way, perhaps the best way, perhaps the only way, in which truly profound experiences of a transcendental nature can be communicated. Because when such experiences are, when an attempt is made that such experiences be communicated in a prosaic or in a quasi-scientific manner, the result is usually very unsatisfactory. But the myth, which has been called the key to the mystery, is really something like that. So somebody hands you that key, and when you turn the key, then you begin to understand, this may mean this may mean that, this relates to me in this fashion, in that fashion. You know, I begin to see that Parsifal or Lohengrin, I don't know why I'm caught up with these Wagnerian themes at the moment, but Wagner is always very energizing to me, you know. It's Germanic empowerment, you know what I mean. But you know, we begin to feel that, you know, these are not just people in someone's imagination or even in history, but they are me. Moi, moi-même, as we say in French. And then the entire meaning becomes much, much more lively, and there is an enlivening, a real enlivening of our own consciousness, of our own psyche. And then, of course, the esoteric tradition moves from the myth to the expression of the myth in let's say, esoteric, or at least esoterically oriented ritual. When we ask ourselves, you know, why is that? Because the ritual is the enactment of the myth. Once again, the opera haunts me for some reason. I guess I need to invest in a visit to the Los Angeles Opera, which, you know, is really quite good. Placido Domingo is the director, so how can it be otherwise? But there is the music, the musical score of the opera, and there is the libretto of the opera. And then there is the performance of the opera. Both the music and the libretto are sort of along the line of the myth, but then there has to be a performance. It's very, very different to read a libretto of an opera, or even just to listen to the operatic music, and it's other thing to see it performed. So the performance then is the ritual. The performance is the sacrament. The performance is the doing of it, so to say. And then what happens after that? Well, owing to such modalities as the myth, as the ritual, there is an amplification of what has been handed on of the original experience that takes place within the person. We know something in our own age about amplification because certainly some of us, and maybe a good many of you, have listened to the way, well, let's say the old phonograph records were on the RCA Victor turntable, the one that the doggy used to listen to. Maybe some of you remember that, you know. And then we have experienced the same kind of music amplified, you know, really amplified. Then amplification takes place, and as the result of that amplification, the individual, because that's whom we are really talking about, who has undergone all of this, is now ready for a further experience, and perhaps experience of his own, rather than of the experience of the founders of his tradition. That's how the esoteric operates. The exoteric is a little different because what is handed on by the original people who experienced is put into scripture, sacred scripture, Bible, Quran, sutras of the Buddha, whatever the case may be. And then these scriptures, as time goes on, are studied and are investigated in various ways by scholars, theologians, biblical scholars, and they extrapolate from these generally two things. And they are dogma. I know that's a bad word, and it's not really related to canine species at all, namely things to believe in and things to do, and more importantly, not to do, commandments, you know. Like was it Lord Russell, Bertrand Russell, who said at one time that Judaism is, well, you have to start a little earlier. Hinduism and Buddhism are be religions, religions of being. Judaism is a do religion, of doing, and Christianity is a don't religion. Well, that was Lord Russell's view, and you know, he had his problems with the kind of fundamentalists who never die out and who are still here, you know. So, and that's where it stops. It doesn't go any further, but belief and commandment, which is either followed or not followed. And that is really, if you take a close look, and I have said this before here and elsewhere, so I really got to go on further to this evening's topic, but this is where the exoteric religiosity, the exoteric traditions are fixated and stuck, all right? Now, so these are the two that we are talking about. And of course they exist in various forms. Many of the great religions, especially of the East, such as Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and so forth, good many others, many of the ancient religions of a Mediterranean origin, such as the religions of the ancient Greeks, of the Romans, of the Egyptians, of the Babylonians, of the Persians, and so forth, all of these had, let's say, an external religion and exoteric, and in close association with it, in a kind of peaceful coexistence with that, they also had esoteric spirituality. In the Mediterranean matrix, these were called the mysteries. Not mystery schools now, that's a kind of 19th century expression which conjures up, I don't know, the little red schoolhouse in Eleusis, or something like that, you know, because they, but really, all levity aside, but only very briefly aside, the mysteries were not places of mental instruction. They were the academy, in Athens and so forth was for that purpose. But the mysteries were institutions of individual spiritual experience and transformation. And they were perfectly, in perfect harmony and coexistence with the exoteric state religions that existed also. There was no conflict between them. By the time, because of the season, I'll bring this up, what is a good definition of peaceful coexistence? It is what the farmer has with the turkey until Thanksgiving Day, okay? So this, be kind to your turkey, as we heard a while ago, your turkey friends, well, you can work that into it somehow, any way that you want to. Now then, let's proceed. So in the exoteric then, all realities are outside of the human. The gods are outside, the demons are outside, and anything in between is all out there. And one has to relate to it in various ways as one relates to external objects. And so we might say the physical as well as the psychic reality is outside. In the esoteric, only the physical reality is outside. And then to a minor degree and extent, perhaps the mental or intellectual reality. And as we get deeper, however, into the psyche of the human, we begin to see that there is a certain connection. and a certain transgressiveness from the external, like the physical and the emotion, so the mind-emotion complex, and something else. This is what, of course, the Greeks called pneuma, spirit. And the Hindus call Atma, and Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. Now, it was always recognized that there is an immense difference between the physical and personal on the one hand, and the transcendental and the spirit on the other. That was always recognized. But it was also recognized that there is a connection, and that when that connection is properly understood and cultivated, then a closeness of the ultimate reality within the human, the spirit, and the human personality can be established, and a tremendous enhancement of the quality, and I don't mean, of course, physical quality, but the quality of life, the quality of consciousness of the individual can come about. Now, in modern theosophy, as many of you are aware, because owing to Madame Blavatsky's efforts, there is a topography of the human being which is sevenfold. There are 7 principles, there are 7 layers, and so forth, which incidentally, she claimed that there was, and she was probably right, that there was a kind of esoteric Tibetan system from whence she derived that 7-fold division. But we know that the ancient Egyptians, the pharaonic Egyptians, had seven principles. So, you know, there's precedent for it. But let's say when we come to the Greeks who, and the Greco-Egyptians who somewhat simplified that, we have really the body, which physical, the soma, the physical form, or hyle, the matter. Then we have psyche, which is the soul, psyche. And the third one, which is beyond all of these, and that is the spirit. But now here is the important thing. There is something mysterious that is like a bridge, like a connection between psyche and pneuma, between soul and the spirit. And that mysterious something was called by the ancient Greeks nous. Nous. I had some Greek in my education, but by now a lot of it is Greek to me. I have a couple of good friends who are my advisors when it comes to Greek, and they usually sit there, and when they say something wrong in the lecture, they signalize to me, you know. But in any event, nous is very difficult to translate. And really a literal translation is not really what is required. But unfortunately, it has also been mistranslated tremendously in the past, and that caused a lot of trouble. Because if you look at the older literature, the nous is usually translated into English as mind. Well, that's not very helpful, because 9 out of 10 people, or even, I don't know, even more, maybe 9.5, will say, oh yeah, mind, well, that's my thinking principle, that's my thinking function, right? But that's not really true. Of course, then in medieval times, and also in Latin, they played with it a little bit, and then they spoke of 2 minds, ratio and intellectus. And the ratio is from where the word reason is derived. Intellect, we know. So the nous was the intellect. The ratio was the lower mind, as it is often called. But unfortunately, owing to that translation, the many very exalted and inspiring statements that have been made in ancient sources about the nous came to be translated as mind. And you find that in older translations of the Hermetic writings, of Gnostic writings, and all kinds of things. Very, very misleading. I won't go into it any further, but it's from that misleading treatment of that principle of nous that a lot of these curious ideas came about, which also have been with us pretty much since the 19th century. And also, I don't know, there is some proclivity that we have for that, especially in America. They're also very much interwoven with the New Age phenomenon, and that is the idea that if you think right, then wonderful things are going to happen to you. You'll get rich, you'll get beautiful, you'll get healthy. What else is there? Well, you'll get thin, right? Right, yeah, you get thin. These are the virtues of our culture, the virtues of our culture. Thin, beautiful, and rich. And healthy. Oh yeah, there's a lot of that too. Everybody tries to get terribly healthy and hardly ever does. So in any event, so you can get goodies by using the quote mind. And what the mistake that they made was that they mistranslated the nous, which the purpose of which and the function of which is not to get goodies for us in our physical or emotional or even ordinary rational lives, but to get us the supreme goodie, which is the spirit. Connect us with the ultimate reality, the ultimate life, and the peace that passeth understanding, as biblical phrase has it. That was the purpose of the nous. You find it in the writings of St. Paul, very clearly expressed in many other places. Now, what we need to do, however, is to see how this principle, first of all, was employed in those crucial cultural and spiritual matrix, which is really the source of our esoteric spirituality, at least in the West, in the Mediterranean area, and subsequently how the great revival of this esoteric tradition, which occurred in the late 1800s, very largely as the result of the instrumentality of that most astonishing person, Madame Blavatsky, how this principle manifests there and how we may understand and practice it, say, today. A very how should I put it, a very admirable gentleman, whom it has been my good fortune to meet a year ago, October, and some of my friends who were there too, in Budapest, in my native city, at the conference of the European School of Theosophy, Dr. David Ruff of Holland and of Belgium. Very, 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 very wonderful gentleman. I really was greatly taken with him and with his approach. He teaches at the University of Maastricht in Holland. He wrote he wrote and gave the Blavatsky lecture this past summer in London, which is given every year, which was entitled The Heavenly Twin. This is a Blavatsky lecture 2010, which was held at the University of Liverpool. His contention, which I share completely, is that the heart and the center of the central sun, if you want to wax very metaphorical about it, as it were, of the esoteric tradition, is simply this, that there is within us a divine self, which we can reach in our earthly life, and which we can first commune with and then unite with. And that really all the multifarious and voluminous teachings of the esoteric tradition, which exist in addition to this rather simple axiom, are really peripheral to that. Now, when I say peripheral, I don't mean to say that they are useless, but they constellate themselves within the literature and the preachments of the tradition because of this first truth that I just mentioned. For instance, it's always experientially and theoretically present in the esoteric tradition that indeed we have, or rather, this divine self, or maybe it's the divine self that has us, if we are lucky. But then, you know, we ask questions. It was the trouble of I think it was Lohengrin, you know, somebody asked the wrong question, then he had to leave. So asking questions has always been a problem in myths. But you know, we ask a question, all right, so I have the divine self within me. How did it get there? In fact, how did I get here? In fact, how did the two of us get here, you know? And then the tradition has to go to work and in some way come forth with a creation myth, with a whole big story as to how this happened. And those stories are not easily come by because, once again, they're really trying to describe the indescribable. I would say that Madame Blavatsky's story in the Secret Doctrine and so forth is probably as good a story in that regard as any, and better than most. And for this reason, I think that, you know, there is a very, very meaningful and useful cosmology there. You know, the cosmogenesis and perhaps even theogenesis. But why is it so useful? You know, is it really that much better to believe, if believe you must, that the ultimate, totally impersonal, great reality poured itself forth, and eventually these outpourings or emanations resulted in a physical world and various things in connection with that physical world, especially our physical body? Or on the other hand, if you believe with the fundamentalists and their kith and kin, that you know, there was somebody there, presumably with a big beard, or at least that's how it is imagined, and he decided, oh, well, let's make a world, what the heck. And then, you know, a world is created and creatures on it and talking snake who causes various problems and so on and so forth. So, okay, you know, there are people who are very happy and are leading very good and satisfying lives who believe all of that. And then there are others who believe in the kind of cosmogony and cosmology that Blavatsky was teaching about. So you see, you don't really specifically profit from either of these that much. But there is, in one respect, they're tremendously different. And what is that? That, see, Blavatsky's cosmology offers you at least a basic idea as to what that nous contacts, what is that spiritual nature, what is that transcendental nature, what is that spark that has come from the flame, and how do you relate to it? The exoteric religions don't really point to that at all. And their way of expressing the mystery is the personal God, creator and redeemer and policeman and judge of the universe and of ourselves within it. And that's their way of looking at it. So when I say that the many teachings, including reincarnation, including karma, all kinds of, the whole gamut of the esoteric tradition is peripheral to this central idea. That's what I mean. But we also need to keep in mind that when the peripheral begins to take the place of that which ought to be central, then we're all in trouble. And it happens. To a certain extent, that is precisely how the exoteric traditions came to be. That the peripheral became all important, and the center was forgotten about. Very, very important to remember. Now then, and while a certain amount of that kind of deleterious development does take place, we have to be very, very careful in this regard. Madame Blavatsky, who was the principal reviver of the esoteric tradition and who founded as its vehicle the Theosophical Society, but of course many other vehicles have developed since, and some were already in existence. She also came to discover that many of her followers, and this is in her own lifetime, embraced the teaching of the God within as a comfortable belief rather than as an existential insight for which one has to strive. And she was not pleased. And when Madame Blavatsky was not pleased, then she generally said so in no unmistakable terms, and she employed the salty language in coming from several places, Russian and English and French. For instance, there's a wonderful little story about her where after having obviously taught this central truth, a lady whom she knew was sort of very excitedly prancing about and saying, I have an indwelling God within me. I have an indwelling light within me. I am God. I am light. And she kept this up. And Madame Blavatsky couldn't take it anymore after a while. And she said, yes, and I hear it snoring. So you see, it is there, but it is deeply asleep within you, my dear, in spite of your protestations here. And of course, she had many, many things to say, reaffirming again and again, over and over again, this very important truth. So, for instance, as far back as 1877, and that's only 2 years after the founding of the society, when she she wrote and published Isis Unveiled. Already in Isis Unveiled at that early time, now I'll call your attention to the fact that Isis Unveiled, for instance, does not teach reincarnation. Doesn't. It's not mentioned. In fact, that was the time when she spoke often rather disdainfully of certain kinds of teachings about reincarnation, which were mainly the spiritists of France, Allan Kardec and his people, who had a different concept of reincarnation. But anyway, she already wrote in this really voluminous manner about the God within. And she said, the first adept initiated but a select few and kept silence with the multitudes. He recognized his God and felt the great being within himself, the Atman, the self, the mighty Lord and protector. Once that man knew him as the I am, the ego sum, which is just Latin, showed his full power to him who could recognize the still small voice. From the days of the primitive man described by the first Vedic poet down to our modern age, what was passed for a modern age in 1877, but of course she was not blessed with post-modernity, whatever that is supposed to mean. In any event, from the days of, if initiated, such a man learned it as a sacred science, if otherwise, then like Socrates, repeating to himself as well as to his fellow men the noble injunction, O man, know thyself, he succeeded in recognizing his God within himself. Ye are gods, the King Psalmist tells us, and we find Jesus reminding the scribes of the expression, ye are gods, was addressed to other mortal men, claiming for himself the same privilege without any blasphemy. And so she goes on from there. So we need to keep in mind that from the very beginning of her re-establishing of the esoteric tradition, she was extremely insistent on this central point. And here I read a little from the words of the aforementioned Dr. David Ruff in his lecture. Unfortunately, between the Scylla of atheism and the Charybdis of monotheism, there is hardly any room left for the notion that the only God we may come in contact with is our own divine self. Now, here is a little possible misunderstanding again. Madame Blavatsky used the term ego, Latin for self, to describe this divine self. And then a good deal later, after she was already gone, the depth psychologists came along, Sigmund Freud and others, and they used the term ego to describe pretty much the opposite, the lower personal self, the emotional and lower mental self. So we have to make allowance for that. So generally, when I quote her here now or other times, I'll substitute the word self for her word ego. It is an exaggeration, says Dr. Ruff, to say that this idea has survived the betrayal of dogmatic religion and the soul-denying creed of materialistic science, thanks to the effort of insights of H.P. Blavatsky, ? The vision that each human soul is essentially an emanation of her own spiritual prototype, the higher self, would have remained to a large extent unknown and certainly misunderstood if it were not resuscitated to its original grandeur by H.P. Blavatsky's writings. This was, of course, the Great Restoration. And Blavatsky was the first one to admit that her material was not original. And she indicated if it had been original, it would have been false. Because they would have come from H.P. Blavatsky rather than from the tradition itself. In fact, she used to make jocularly a nice little difference between herself and H.P. Blavatsky. For instance, there is a copy of when the beautiful little book, The Voice of the Silence, was published, she inscribed it, and this was the inscription: from HPB to H.P. Blavatsky with no kind regards. So that is how she sort of indicated the duality that she was aware of. In 1879, that's all quite early, she wrote an article, What is Theosophy? And there she wrote, for instance, hence the samadhi or dhyan yoga samadhi of the Hindu ascetics, the daimonion foti, or spiritual illumination of the Neoplatonists, the sidereal confabulation of soul of the Rosicrucians and fire philosophers, and even the ecstatic trance of many mystics and of the modern mesmerists and even spiritualists, whom she generally had a lot of bones to pick with, are identical in nature, though various as to manifestations. The search after man's diviner self, so often and so erroneously interpreted as individual communion with a personal God, was the object of every mystic, and belief in its possibility seems to have been coeval with the genesis of humanity, each people giving it an other name. In the key to theosophy, I hope you're not getting too bored with all these quotations. Now, a little bit bored is okay, but when too much, then you have to signalize to me. Like, I never mind when people look at their watches, but when they take them off and then put them to their ear and shake them like that, that's when I get the point. So I don't know whether you might want to do that or not. In the key to theosophy, and that's a pretty late book, so I picked the earlier and the later one. We believe that every human being is the bearer or vehicle of an ego, a self, coeval with every other self, because all selves or egos are of the same essence and belong to the primeval emanation from one universal infinite self. Plato calls the latter the logos, and we the manifested divine principle, which is one with the universal soul, not the anthropomorphic, extra-cosmic and personal God in which so many theists believe. I have a very large number of quotations here which really would put you to sleep, or at least make you annoyed. So I better not go on with them too much, maybe just a couple more. Here is HPB again about the divine self. Between man and the animal, there is the impassable abyss of mentality and self-consciousness. What is human mind in its highest aspect? Whence comes it? If it is not a portion of the essence, and in some rare cases of incarnation, the very essence of a higher being, one from a higher and divine plane. Can the human be the product of material nature by evolution alone, even as it is the animal which differs from man in external shape, but by no means in the material of its physical fabric, seeing that the intellectual potentialities of the two differ as the sun does from the globe? And what is it that creates such a difference? And this is, of course, the clincher. Unless the human is an animal plus a living God within his physical self. And another rather short statement, which probably really would be enough just in itself. Remember that the only God man comes in contact with is his own God, called spirit, soul, and nous, or consciousness, and these three are one. Also a statement in Isis Unveiled, never for a moment lose sight of your divine and immortal soul. And that one is of some meaning to me, because of a man I knew. This sort of like St. Paul says, I knew a man whether in the body or, this was in the body, who he sort of developed a little exercise that he was doing. And he kept repeating this phrase to himself, never for a moment lose sight of your divine and immortal soul. And that sort of put him into an exalted state of consciousness. And then sort of question arose in his mind, no doubt coming from the lower mind, saying, well, how can I not lose sight of the divine and immortal soul when I'm not seeing him? And at that moment, a huge golden being stood in front of him in a blaze of light and said, now you see me, and don't lose sight of me, and then disappear. It would be just an interesting little vision. It really changed that man's life immensely. He was totally devoted to this reality for the rest of his life, and did all kinds of rather interesting things that helped in that regard. Okay, where are we here? These things stick together. Now, of course, it could be that H.P. Blavatsky just snatched one of the pages and said, "You've quoted me enough," or something of this sort. But no, she didn't do that. So I think, in view of the time, we need to sort of begin to sum up very quickly, and to arrive perhaps at some possibly helpful conclusions. So I would summarize this in a number of points. Number one, there is an esoteric tradition as distinct from the exoteric tradition of spirituality. The latter are always, at best, the exoteric as shadows of the former. It is important not to confound the two. And I'm reminded, I'll mention that very quickly, whenever the Parliament of the World's Religions was here in Chicago, a very memorable occasion for so many of us. One of the days we came out of downtown Chicago here, and right here in this room, my and good friend of many of us, Mr. John Kuntz, the son of Dora Kuntz, and from a very illustrious family and a man of many experiences, gave a talk, and in which he almost shocked me how definite and specific he was in saying that even in the work of the Theosophical Society, there was always an exoteric movement, and there was an esoteric movement. And he said that, for instance, all the certainly very commendable work of Colonel Olcott with promoting the relationship of various religions and with the Buddhists and so on, all of that, he said, that was Olcott. But H.P.B., she didn't use those words, H.P.B. Blavatsky had other fish to fry. And I said, Blavatsky's position was, and I certainly agree wholeheartedly, that we can promote all kinds of good causes or causes that at the time we think are good. But if something really good is not taking over within us, the good that we are trying to do is not going to be good any longer. Isn't that really the history of the world and the history of religion? And so many people have been trying to good. That didn't have to be religious people, all kinds of people. Before you know it, what the good that they tried to do became not only something indifferent, but an evil. And so, you see, this esoteric trust is of extremely great importance. Without it, all kinds of good that we may do is not going to turn out so good. And indeed, we will have fallen out, and I'm talking individually, fallen out of the bosom of the esoteric tradition. And that would be a great and terrible thing, and that is something we have to really guard against. Secondly, the esoteric tradition is reborn at various times in history. At such times, its central message, which is, as we have seen, the inner God, is accompanied by amplifying and explanatory material, such as mythology, cosmology, creation myths, and stories. For in that and the like, then the latter are never to take the place or to obscure the central message. For in that case, the particular rebirth of the tradition becomes a stillbirth. Very, very important. Now, you might say, but, goodness gracious, aren't there wonderful stories about various people's incarnations and what went on in Atlantis and places like that? Isn't that, really very enjoyable material? Yes, it is. And there has always been sort of what could be called spiritual entertainment in religious traditions. the acts, the early acts that were probably all put together by Lucius Carinus, the acts of Thomas, the acts of John, the acts of Peter, were of that nature. In them there are wonderful little esoteric gems, and the rest of it is sort of the Star Trek of the first century, you know. But, you know, that is all right, but we have to get back to the center. We have to get back to the central message, and not only its recognition, but certainly its practice as well. And the last major rebirth of the tradition, which occurred on circa 135 years ago by way of the work of H.P. Blavatsky and her associates, this movement became, and I think that term comes from our friend Professor Robert Elwood, became the grandfather movement of esoteric organizations right up to the present New Age. And you know, if you look at them and look at their material, virtually all of these proclaim the reality of the indwelling Godhead of the human, but have done little more than proclaim. And fourth, and perhaps last, the kind of belief, no kind of belief is a substitute for experience. To exchange a materialistic or even an exoteric belief for a so-called esoteric belief is of little utility. We should not, I wouldn't even hesitate to say, waste our time and our energy to convert people from one belief to another. But if we can convert people from belief to experience, from belief to a true inner knowing or gnosis, then perhaps our exertions would not be in vain. The belief even in axioms that are true will fail without such experience. The greatest virtues themselves become enfeebled and corrupted without the experience of the divine self. And let me see where, yeah, it's time to conclude, so I will conclude with these thoughts. We almost inevitably are greatly tempted, and sometimes we succumb to that temptation to think that by just thinking about something, it's happening. You know, Professor Ernest Wood was a great and wonderful man. I remember once said to us, what you have to remember is that thinking only leads to more thinking. It doesn't lead to anything else. So consciousness must be altered, indeed transformed. And there are indications regarding this in various places, even in our contemporary world. I intend this Saturday to speak about one of them in an astonishing work that while it was written many years ago, right after World War I, has just been published now, the Liber Novus, the new book, often called the Red Book by C.G. Jung, which points very, very beautifully in this direction. And perhaps the time may have come, but one always has to be careful about chronological speculations, because practically all prophets who have prophesied something for a particular time and for a particular date inevitably are proven wrong. So I'm not going to do that. But I do have an intuition, and I think I can support it with some data, that somehow the great wheel has come around again to a particular point when this all-important issue, this central reality of the esoteric tradition, which is not only the central reality of the tradition, but our central reality, will be called attention to, and where we will begin to exert ourselves mightily in the direction of accomplishing union with it and the recognition of it. And so I will conclude with a little passage from The Voice of the Silence, which, while of course it bears H.P. Blavatsky's name, was probably translated by her from earlier sources. In fact, not only probably, but I think 2 Dalai Lamas, the 13th and the 14th, had agreed with that proposition. Wonderful little book. And here is an important passage from it. Seek for him who is to give thee birth in the hall of wisdom, the hall which lies beyond, wherein all shadows are unknown, and where the light of truth shines with unfading glory. That which is uncreate abides in thee. Disciple, as it abides in that hall, if thou wouldst reach it and blend the two, thou must divest thyself of thy dark garments of illusion. Stifle the voice of flesh, allow no image of the senses to get between its light and thine, that thus the twain may blend in one. And if we have even to a tiny little extent advanced, the all-important and the sacred object of the twain blending into one this evening, then I think our presence here has not been in vain. And in that hope and in that expectation, I'll conclude my main remarks at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephan. Are there questions? I'll give you a minute to think about it. And do we have questions from the cyberspace?
You're familiar with the article that I posted on our website, Pappas and Blavatsky, the Russian Sphinx meets the Balzac of the occult. And I would like to formulate this question, as I am aware that through Madame Blavatsky's life, she collected many of these esoteric traditions, many of them coming from the Orient. And towards the end of her life, as we have seen, she started to put more stock in the work of her secretary, G.R.S. Mead, and his associates and what he was doing. And you and I are part of a great revival of esotericism in the Gnostic Church within these past, well, at least since the World War, the end of the World War and the beginning of the 60s and 70s. What are your thoughts about if Madame Blavatsky had lived a little bit longer? Do you think that she would have taken up the shield of Gnosis and carried it forward?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, thanks so much, Robert. Yeah, well, I think that she had taken up the shield of Gnosis already in her lifetime. There is a very nice little book that a Dutchman, whose name escapes me at the moment, a Dutch scholar had put together, Madame Blavatsky and Gnosticism. And it's a thick book it's all composed of quotations of Blavatsky about the Gnostics, a thick book about this big. She had never said anything bad about the Gnostic tradition, and she certainly, I think to second guess Madame Blavatsky is a terrible project. And I am not about to undertake it, but I would say that all reasonable expectation would indicate that she would be very pleased with what has happened with the discovery of the Naj Hammadi documents and all the scholarship that has gone in that regard. And indeed, much of the change in the public mind regarding the tradition. And I think that would be very much up along her line. She chose the name Theosophy from the founder of Neoplatonism, from the God-taught philosopher who was called Theodidactos just because of that, because he was taught by his inner deity, and she saw really the three-leaved clover of Neoplatonic tradition, Hermetic tradition, and Gnostic tradition as just that, as three manifestations of one. So I think she would be rather glad about many things that are happening now. But sort of my effort was in the direction, why don't we make her even happier by putting some of her insights into action? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, sir. There you go.
There was a quote that I read by Rudolf Steiner, who said that Christianity was the world's last great religion. Considering the revelations that were revealed in Jung's Red Book, and the importance of this symbol of Christ and the personal transformation that we all seem to have to go through, is it time for maybe the Theosophical Society to consider Steiner's viewpoint, or perhaps the direction that he was trying to take the society a little bit more seriously, or maybe incorporate more of his direction into the society's direction?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I would say that if I would agree to the extent that some of the insights that were voiced by Dr. Steiner, as well as by some other people, and which, let's say, have assumed a certain topicality and reality at this time, are certainly very much worth considering. I, for myself, would be cautious because of the extreme volume and diversity of Rudolf Steiner's teachings, many of which I don't feel a particular affinity for. As to the Christian religion having been the last great world religion, chronologically, that's certainly true. It's a historical fact. But let's say, as I hope to mention at least on Saturday in connection with the Red Book, if one agrees with him, I agree with him, but I'm sure many other people don't, much of the material in the Red Book is also a corrective to Christianity. And while Jesus appears actually a couple of times in the Red Book, and I'll read that portion and so forth, and he's treated with great reverence, both by the writer and by this archetypal figure of Philemon who is there. But it's really the indication of this particular prophecy, really, as Jung calls it, although it's not just a prophecy about the future, is that what has been left undone and unsaid by Christianity, the time is coming now to redress that. So it's not a pure endorsement of the Christian tradition, but rather a corrective of the same. I know that Steiner also lived later and died in Switzerland, so Jung was in Switzerland, but somehow of the two residents of Switzerland, I opt more for Jung than I do for Rudolf Steiner. But that's me, what can I do?
I think that was Dr. Steiner's point also.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good, yeah.
There would be no more great religions, but that this would be a personal transformation that every human being would have to take up. It's a very similar message to what Jung states. And in fact, if you read some of the earlier writings of Steiner, some of the great ideas that Jung proposes later in his research, Steiner predates in a number of instances.
That may be so. All right, let's see what else we got. Yeah.
Can I ask, as far as nous goes, would you say that's something that we need more to discover or develop?
The nous, yeah. Well, of course, it's there. it needs, shall we say, it needs to be cultivated. You know, it needs to be it needs to be vivified and employed by us. It is just like, shall we say, maybe for some reason we haven't used our right hand for a long, long time or so, and we need to learn how to use it again. It's there. It's not something that has to be put in place. And I strongly suspect that that development of the nous is a transformational process. And that is why Jung and some others were so fond at a certain point of the metaphors of alchemy, because that indicates that a transformation needs to take place in order for the stone of the philosophers to be there, which is the connection with the transcendental. So I would say that it is not so much, except with a very few people perhaps, it is not so much a momentary revelation, boom, here it is, but a process of transformation that leads to such a internal revelatory experience. Mm-hmm.
On the subject of nous, I can't help but to reflect on the Gospel of Mary, in which she asks the appearance of the risen Christ, how she should see him, and he goes into the lecture about the nous, indicating an imaginative faculty.
Gospel of Mary
divine.
in the Berlin Codex, which unfortunately is a little fragmentary. Mary Magdalene asked Jesus, among others, as to that she saw him. She had a communing experience with him. He's no longer in the body, by the way, as far as one can tell. And did I do that with my soul, or did I do that with my spirit? And he says, neither of them, but the nous. That is in between the two. So you can see that the method is there, and of course we find indications of it elsewhere. Dr. Ruff in his lecture has some wonderful quotations from Hermetic sources. Otherwise, that one particular Hermetic teacher, I forget his name now, the nous appeared to him again as a figure, as a great big towering figure, and he discoursed with him, and he said, who are you? He said, you should know who I am. I am the nous. You know, I am the one who does the mediating with the spirit. Now, come on, don't be so shook up, you know. and so these kinds of incidents, but that is certainly one of the clearest short statement is in the Gospel of Mary. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right.
Far in the back.
Well, the last shall be first.
I was interested in your comments about the time has come and a sense of some kind of a critical moment being reached in our time, and particularly at this moment. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kind of things you mean by that and the sort of evidence you say you have for it.
I can always count on my friends to try to pin me down, you know. Yes. Well, first of all, I also accompanied by saying that chronological speculations are very hazardous, and that prophets who speak thus are then usually proven wrong. Nevertheless, we have to admit that there are certain pivotal periods in history when some of these changes occur. And it would be possible that we are perhaps already within and are progressing further within a process of that nature. Because certainly if, if you've been around for a while, and as the song says, is anyone as old as I, I've been around during this whole period, there has been a tremendous change and a tremendous reorientation in rather large circles, at least in Western culture. and at very high scholarly levels, many of them, regarding these issues. And what, of course, facilitated them to a very large extent was the discovery of the Naj Hammadi material, to some extent the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so I think the culture has now been saturated with ideas that are along this line. The seeds have been sown. Now the question is whether the sunshine, the climate, will be powerful enough to really make them come forth and sprout, because there are always contrary forces at work as well. And I think a great deal of the sort of materialistic secularism of our age even has a tendency to reduce great and sacred realities such as this to a triviality. Because these, what I have said here can be interpreted in a very wrong-headed way, in saying that we here in this body, this terrestrial personality with all of its foibles and all of its faults and counter-virtues, this is the one who is the God. And so you see, I am God and there is no other God above me. A very Jehovic or archonic statement. So there are confusing and contrary forces that one has to be careful of. But at the same time, I think there is also a great deal of indication that a progress on a fairly large scale in the consciousness of the culture may take place, and it would be a progress in a desirable direction. But as I say, I'm very leery of New Age and this and that. Although, of course, the zodiacal age is the age of Aquarius, contrary to all the 1960s songs and all of that, you know, it would play a part in that. Only it would be over a much longer period than what people envisioned in the 60s. In the 60s, they thought, well, it's going to happen just like that. Even Jung says, in connection with the Red Book, at least another 800 years before it really would take hold. But I think to some extent it may be taking hold already.